February 25th, 1986. The Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union commences in Moscow. Soviet Chairman Mikhail Gorbachev announces his plans for perestroika. The plan is to commence restructuring of the Soviet government and economy, which has become stagnant. This plan is viewed by many as an attempt to shift from communism to democracy, and is resisted by older Communist Party members, such as Minister of Defense Marshal Sergei Sokolov. By the end of the Congress on March 6, many members of the Communist Party begin to view Gorbachev as a threat to the USSR. Secret plans between Sokolov and other party members begin in earnest. November 7th, 1987. Just after the end of the May Day celebrations, Sokolov, with full support of the army, launches a military coup. Initially, the KGB tries to stop him, but soon they too join his forces. November 11th, 1987. Gorbachev resigns and is imprisoned. He is never heard from again. Sokolov becomes General Secretary of a new hardline regime. February 5th, 1988. By this time, relations between the USSR and USA have reached a new low. With the Soviet economy still grinding slowly along, Sokolov and his ministers see the only way forward is to capture oil fields. Seeing also the need to remove the US as an economic powerhouse, Sokolov asks his Minister of Defense Alexander Kuldanov to gather ideas and plan on a way to remove the Western issue from the table. March 11th, 1988. Kuldanov, his generals and strategic planners begin drafting operations for a way to seize oil fields in Alaska and look at methods of crippling the US economy. August 14th, 1988. Operation Red Tide is officially approved. It is the sea and airborne invasion of the United States. The first stage is a low-yield nuclear bomb to be set off in the heart of Washington, D.C., and another to be smuggled in a suitcase by double agents into NORAD in the Colorado mountains. This will have the effect of cutting off the head of the US civilian and military command structures, sowing enough seeds of confusion to implement the remainder of the operation. Stage 2 is the concentrated bombing of Honolulu, and primarily the Pearl Harbor naval base. Simultaneous to the attack on Pearl Harbor, there will be the sea and airborne invasions of key cities in the states of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California. Primary targets including numerous oil fields in Alaska and the cities of Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. The third stage is the largest. It will be the breakout from the targets and the capture of the entire states, with a push down into Nevada and Texas, using a leapfrog tactic with airborne regular and Spetsnaz troops to either capture key oil fields or destroy them. Cuba will then launch an invasion of Texas to meet up with Soviet forces and occupy Houston, Austin, and minor oil fields in the state. November 29th, 1988. The governments of Cuba and Warsaw Pact nations secretly agree to the plan. Soviet military forces are already building up under the umbrella of military exercises. January 11th, 1989. The USSR announced a naval military exercise to be conducted in the Sea of Japan, a cover for the buildup of forces. Labeled Operation Allied Defense, NATO officially protests against the exercise, calling it a provocative action against the sovereignty of the waters of the Japanese government. February 23rd, 1989. Operation Allied Defense ends. However, the assembled forces do not all head back to their home ports. Major amounts of Warsaw Pact troops remain in the Soviet port of Petropavlovsk. And on March 19th, Fidel Castro begins his troop buildup in Havana. April 2nd, KGB spies within the US report that there will be an upcoming gap in coverage of US spy satellites, covering an area from Petropavlovsk to the Aleutian Islands on June 11th. Operation Red Tide has its date. June 11th, 1989. The Soviet fleet embarks. It is the largest collection of warships since World War II. June 13th, the massive fleet splits into 3 groups. North will invade Alaska, South will attack Hawaii, and Central will move on the west coast. It is ordered that all forces will navigate with radio silence. At 11:50 p.m. local time, reports reach the CIA in Washington that a massive Soviet fleet has disappeared from Petropavlovsk. CIA Director William Webster decides against waking President Bush, but will include it in an urgent morning briefing on June 14th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. June 14th, 1989. 1000 hours Eastern Standard Time. A low-yield nuclear suitcase bomb is detonated outside the White House, leveling it and surrounding buildings. An identical device is also detonated inside NORAD in Colorado, rendering the two most important heads of control void. The Capitol building is also destroyed. The Pentagon is damaged, but remains intact. However, radiation covers most of the metropolitan area. President Bush and much of his cabinet are killed. 1100 hours Cuban Daylight Time. Cuban ground forces under Castro launch an all-out assault on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Over 3,000 soldiers from both sides are killed in the first hour. 0500 hours Hawaiian Standard Time. Pearl Harbor is obliterated by fighters and bombers from the aircraft carriers Kiev, Novorossiysk, and Admiral Gorshkov in a heavy and concentrated surprise tactical bombing strike. While many of the ships are not at anchor, the action renders the capability of Pacific Naval Command almost non-existent. 0800 hours Pacific Standard Time. Simultaneous to the attack on Pearl Harbor, task forces North and Central launch their invasions. On the West Coast, the invasions are preceded by helicopter air attack launched from the aircraft carriers Moskva and Leningrad. 1019 hours Eastern Standard Time. The official declaration of war is received through the UN. Declarations of war are also delivered from Warsaw Pact nations, the action being compounded by the loss of Washington, D.C. 0920 hours Alaskan Standard Time. Infantry, mechanized and armored units storm into Anchorage, Alaska, with a preemptive strike on Elmendorf Air Force Base, completely catching the 5073rd Air Base Group of the Alaskan Air Command by total surprise and destroying them. The U.S. Army at Fort Richardson attempts to mount a rearguard action and retreat from the city area, but are annihilated due to overwhelming Soviet numbers. 0820 hours Pacific Standard Time. Infantry, mechanized and armored units storm the shores of Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. For the next 2 hours, there is total chaos amongst the surviving factions of the U.S. government, as officials scramble to determine who is still alive in the presidential line of succession. It is learned that Vice President Dan Quayle was not at the White House. He was aboard Air Force Two heading towards Washington, D.C. His flight was diverted to JFK International Airport in New York. 1320 hours Eastern Standard Time. Quayle is sworn in on the tarmac at JFK as the 42nd President of the United States. The U.S. Atlantic and Pacific fleets are scattered. Norfolk Command gets orders to all ships in the Atlantic to head home and provide coastal support. The only orders given to the Pacific ships are to evade the enemy. June 15th, 1989. Conflict erupts in Europe along the east-west German border, with French and British fleets putting immediately to sea. Mexico officially declares its neutrality. And later that day, Bob Hawke's government in Australia immediately declares war on the Soviet Union. Shortly before the complete fall of Pacific Command, orders are given to the USS Carl Vinson. She is ordered to head to Sydney, Australia, to rally the Allied nations there and return to break the enemy's flank. However, the Carl Vinson carrier group is pursued by Soviet forces. In a desperate rearguard action, the carrier group loses a multitude of vessels, but is able to beat the Soviet forces back long enough to evade their radar screens. After reports come in of Soviet submarine action outside the harbors of Sydney and Cairns, Captains Richmond and Haig of the Vinson and Missouri decide not to head to Sydney, but instead to Auckland, New Zealand, as it will not be an anticipated move. With the Soviets no longer pursuing them, they change their course, both captains feeling that the tide of the war may now rest on their decisions.